It seems to me, first of all, from what I understand from doctors, that's really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
And when it comes to establishing your worldview, I was curious, what newspapers and magazines did you regularly read before you were tapped for this to stay informed and to understand the world?
I've read most of them, again, with a great appreciation for the press, for the media.
But like what ones specifically, I'm curious that you...
all of them, any of them that have...
Can demonic spirits attach themselves to inanimate objects? The answer is yes.
Welcome to Twatwaffle of the Week. Before we begin, I feel it necessary to mention that I will not be tackling the bullocks presented concerning transgender issues. Not because the issues are unimportant, but because while there is some overlap, it's not my forte. In other words, I don't want to misrepresent either side's discussion points. I readily admit I have much to learn and much to understand. And over the course of the past year or so, it's something I have been attempting to do. Sometime in the future, near future that is, I may tackle the issue head-on in some manner. In the notes, you will find a recent posting by Callie Wright. I believe, in some way, shape, or form, it explains why getting the discussion points correct is so important. And it's something I don't feel I'm qualified to do, but Callie is very apt at it. She is a trans activist, and one that I highly regard and admire. This is a reality, unlike myself, she faces every day. So with that said, the other day, some goofy organization shared the following meme, which you will have to look at the video to see, but I will include it in the show notes, on their timeline. I'm not going to provide the URL. The name of the organization is prominent, so easily found. The wall of text that was included is your typical Christian anti-LGBTQI bullshit, with a little extra hatred thrown in. That's pretty much what I'm going to focus on. In other words, nothing new for me. And what I'm going to do is break these down into panels. There's kind of a schematic characteristic to this creed. Panel 1. For brevity's sake, I will not be arguing whether the U.S. is a Christian nation or not. Plain and simple, God, Jesus, Christianity, etc. is not mentioned in our Constitution, regardless of what David Barton says. Our laws are governed by what is held within the confines of those august words, with Scoutists offering opinions based on such. With that said, nothing comes between such rulings, and what God has to say on the matter is moot. If you believe otherwise, in the privacy of your own home, that's fine. Try to legislate that notion, we have a problem. You may want to take a look at what the Bible considers marriage, because quite frankly, I'm confused. We have one man, one woman. We have straight up polygamy. We have what's called levirate marriage, which is basically when a woman was widowed without a son, it became the responsibility of the brother-in-law or close male relative to fuck her. If the child was a son, hopefully, for her sake, he would then be considered the heir of her late husband, even though the husband had nothing to do with his conception. We also have, as I said, straight up polygamy or polygamy and concubines. We have the rapist plus victim. We have man plus woman's property, i.e. slaves. we have male soldiers and prisoners of war. And there is also male slave plus female slave. So, sorry to say, but your book says nothing consistent about what marriage is. Using it as the be-all, end-all guide in the definition of marriage is ridiculous. Marriage has never been defined as one man, one woman, especially within the confines of your holy book. So whatever mental gymnastics you have to use to come to that conclusion is, in my opinion, outright fabrication. Either that, or you have never read the damn fucking book. But even in modern times, the marriage argument is not, nor has it ever been, about one of equality, nor has it been about one of tradition. Plain and simple, it's about old-fashioned discrimination on the basis of sex. Quote,
To accept same-sex marriage is to accept this modern idea that marriage is about love and partnership, instead of about dutiful procreation and female submission. Traditional gender roles where husbands rule over wives are disintegrating, and that process is definitely helped along by these new laws allowing that marriage doesn't have to be a gendered institution at all.
That's something that Ross Douthat espouses. Now compare that to the following from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which was highlighted during the oral arguments in Oberfellsch. And basically it's going along the lines of how our idea about marriage has already changed. Quote, "We have changed our idea about marriage is the point that I made earlier. Marriage today is not what it was under the common law tradition. Under the civil law tradition, marriage was a relationship of a dominant male to a subordinate female. That ended as a result of this court's decision in 1982 when Louisiana's head and master rule was struck down, and no state was allowed to have such a marriage anymore. Would that be a choice that a state should be allowed to have?" End quote. So, in other words, marriage may have been understood at one time to be that which you claim. It is no more, and it has been that way for some time. As Ian Millhiser points out, quote,
Justice Ginsburg's point was that until surprisingly recently, the legal institution of marriage was defined in terms of gender roles. According to Sir William Blackstone, an 18th century English jurist whose works are still frequently cited today to explain the common law principles we inherited from our colonial rulers, the very beginning or legal existence of the woman is suspended during marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. As late as 1887, fully one-third of the states did not permit women to control their earnings, and married women could not even withhold consent to sex with their husband until shockingly recently.
end quote. A corollary to this, and I have noted this thought numerous times, but it's worth doing so again. While Ken Ham, in some regards, is not reflective of all Christians, he's quite vocal. He really succinctly sums up the why so important argument of the LGBTQI issue.
The homosexual issue flows from this. Genesis says that God created marriage between one man and one woman. He didn't create it between two men or two women, or two men and one woman, or three men and one woman, or two women and one man, or three women and one man. If other parts of Genesis aren't true, then how could this idea of marriage be true? If there were no Adam and Eve, and we're all evolved from ape-like ancestors, and there's homosexuality in the animal world and in Genesis's mythology, then you can justify any behavior you want.
Basically, what Ham and Mortensen are referring to is the whole notion of the authority of Scripture. In their eyes, because creationism is about gay marriage and not really about science or reality, science and reality doesn't matter to a creationist or to his minions. In the minds of a religionist, the ramifications of their belief has no consequence, as the Bible trumps all. So if someone like Leela Acorn kills herself, the religionists could give two shits. They don't care. In their mind, Elkhorn is getting her just rewards. Now, just to be clear on this point, I have a really hard time making a distinction between a so-called moderate or a member of the Christian Taliban or Christian ISIS. In my mind, if you claim Christianity, if you claim Islam, if you claim Judaism, you claim it all. End of story. You've heard me say it before. There are no moderate Christians, there are no moderate Muslims, and there are no moderate Jews. It's all or none, baby. The main theme of this first panel, then, is understood to be what is called complementarianism. Besides the fact that this doctrine is completely man-made, the founding can be traced to the 1988 Danvers Statement from the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, but also to the 1991 book Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, A Response to Evangelical Feminism by John Piper and Wayne Grudman. There are some other flaws. The most obvious flaw is that it ignores science. Quote,
An idea permeates our modern view of relationships, that men and women have always paired off in sexually exclusive relationships. But before the dawn of agriculture, humans may actually have been quite promiscuous. Author Christopher Ryan walks us through the controversial evidence that human beings are sexual omnivores by nature, in hopes that a more nuanced understanding may put an end to discrimination, shame, and the kind of unrealistic expectations that kill relationships.
The reason I bring that up, and granted, Piper and Grudman's book was written prior to this TED Talk, this general idea of complementarianism is still very popular, and they still support it in spite of science. Another problem that I have, if I can use that word, in order to support the view of complementarianism, it's basically based in a faulty, if not heretical by some standards, notion of the Trinity. It comes down to that Christianity can't get its doctrine straight between all the various denominations and offshoots, hence why there's 10,000 plus denominations worldwide, with 3,000 of them being practiced in the U.S. alone. You would think that an omnipotent God, this really wouldn't be an issue. Very briefly and very simply, complementarians create a hierarchy within the Trinity. Just as they subjugate women to men, they subjugate Christ to God. In a very twisted manner, complementarians have basically minimized the mission of Christ by keeping man under the curse of the fall. Just to be clear, that statement was a hugely overly simplified view of complementarianism. In general, I just focused on two aspects of why maintaining this point of view is so full of cognitive dissonance. The CBMW doctrine is way more in depth than what I presented, but I think you can get my drift. The point primarily being that this is a man-made doctrine. And if you don't believe me, go read Plato's Symposium. the reuniting of man and woman versus the reunifying sexual counterparts into an integrated sexual whole. So they're almost identical. As Micah points out in the information above, it is a doctrine that is for the most part reliant on the teachings of Paul, but devoid of words of Christ. In general, complementarianism can be said to be a doctrine that holds to the belief that God made Eve to be a physical and emotional complement for Adam. Therefore, God would never bless other marriage relationships. See Genesis 2. The only relationship God mentions in the second chapter of Genesis is a heterosexual relationship between one man and one woman. It's based on an unrealistic, literal reading of Genesis. They read into Scripture what Scripture does not say, and then teach what Scripture does not say as the absolute truth. Coming up next, a couple of clever passages.